This episode contains discussions of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care whilst listening. Fear rarely begins in the moment that people remember it beginning. More often, it starts much earlier than that, quietly, gradually, and without the kind of clarity that allows anyone to confidently say exactly when ordinary life first began to feel different. And psychologically, that matters. Because human beings do not need certainty in order to begin responding to danger. In fact, uncertainty itself can become psychologically powerful enough to alter behaviour long before people fully understand why they feel unsafe. At first, those changes are small enough to dismiss. A route home reconsidered. A hesitation that did not exist before. A growing discomfort attached to places and routines that had once felt emotionally neutral. And individually, those moments can seem insignificant. But collectively, they begin to reshape the emotional atmosphere people live inside. Because fear does not only exist as an emotional response to confirmed danger. Often it develops through anticipation, through possibility, through the growing awareness that something about the world around you no longer feels entirely predictable in quite the same way it once did. And once unpredictability enters ordinary life, people begin adjusting themselves emotionally in response to it. Sometimes consciously, and sometimes without even fully realizing that they are doing it. In cases like this, that psychological shift is important, because before fear becomes public language, it often becomes private behaviour first. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history, and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles. Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper. Episode 4, The Growing Unease. By this stage in the case, understanding remained incomplete. There was still no universally accepted explanation connecting every incident together with complete certainty. And yet emotionally, something had already begun to shift. And psychologically, one of the most unsettling aspects of uncertainty is that it rarely stays contained within the specific events that create it. Instead, it begins spreading outward into ordinary life itself. Because human beings are constantly attempting to assess safety, constantly scanning environments, routines, behaviours, and information for signs that something may no longer be entirely secure. Most of the time, that process happens quietly in the background. So quietly, in fact, that people barely notice it is happening at all. But when uncertainty becomes prolonged, when incidents repeat without clear explanation, that background process becomes far more emotionally active. People begin paying attention differently. Journeys that had once been automatic now require thought. Decisions that had once felt emotionally neutral began carrying hesitation. And psychologically, hesitation matters because it reflects the moment ordinary behaviour starts becoming influenced by anticipated threat. Not confirmed danger, anticipated danger. Women who had once moved through familiar places without needing to think carefully about them now found themselves emotionally negotiating ordinary decisions in ways they had not before. Which route felt safer? What time should I leave? Should I walk alone? Should I take the longer way home instead? And psychologically, what makes this important is that these behaviours often develop before people fully understand why they are changing. Because fear does not always arrive through direct knowledge. Sometimes it develops through emotional atmosphere alone, through repeated conversation, through partial information, through the growing sense that something difficult to define has begun settling, quietly, into ordinary life. And once ordinary behaviour becomes shaped by anticipation of danger, people begin carrying emotional tension into spaces that had previously felt neutral. A familiar street no longer feels entirely familiar. An ordinary evening no longer feels entirely ordinary. And psychologically, that gradual erosion of emotional certainty can become exhausting over time. Because human beings rely heavily upon predictability in order to feel safe. Not absolute safety, but emotional confidence in the environments we move through every day. And once that confidence begins weakening, vigilance often replaces it. Anticipation can be psychologically exhausting. Because unlike immediate danger, uncertainty offers no clear emotional resolution. There is no definitive understanding, no fixed boundary, no reassuring explanation capable of restoring emotional certainty completely. So instead, the mind continues searching for pattern, searching for predictability, searching for reassurance that the environment still makes sense. In 1978, Yvonne Pearson disappeared. She was 21 years old. And like the women already discussed throughout this series, she existed as a full person long before becoming associated with this case. She was somebody with routines, relationships, experiences, and a future that extended far beyond the circumstances that later connected her to this narrative. At the time of her disappearance, uncertainty still shaped understanding. There was no immediate clarity surrounding what had happened. And psychologically unresolved uncertainty creates a particularly difficult emotional state, both individually and collectively. Because uncertainty leaves space. Space for fear, space for speculation. space for the mind to continue returning repeatedly to unanswered questions that cannot yet be resolved. And psychologically, unresolved fear often becomes more emotionally consuming precisely because it lacks definition. The human mind struggles with ambiguity. Human beings naturally seek conclusions, explanations, and emotional closure capable of restoring a sense of predictability to the world around them. But during periods of uncertainty, closure remains unavailable. And when closure remains unavailable for long enough, emotional tension begins embedding itself into everyday life. That is part of what was happening here. Not simply fear of isolated incidents, but the gradual psychological erosion of certainty itself. One of the reasons pattern recognition becomes so psychologically complicated in cases like this is because human beings are naturally cautious about drawing connections too quickly. And in many situations, that caution is reasonable. Premature conclusions carry consequences. False assumptions carry consequences. So the mind naturally searches for inconsistencies as much as it does similarities. Different locations, different circumstances, different details that make events appear separate enough to resist immediate connection. And psychologically, those inconsistencies matter because they slow certainty from fully forming. Not necessarily because people fail to notice similarities, but because uncertainty still leaves enough room for alternative explanations to survive. And that creates an emotionally uncomfortable space between suspicion and understanding. A space where people begin feeling that something may be wrong long before they can fully explain why they feel that. Psychologically, that tension can become exhausting because human beings are not naturally comfortable living inside prolonged uncertainty. We want resolution. We want emotional clarity. We want the reassurance that events still exist within boundaries that feel understandable and controllable. But during periods like this, those boundaries begin weakening. And once emotional certainty begins weakening, fear starts spreading beyond the immediate events themselves. In 1977, Jean Jordan was killed. She was 20 years old. And again, it is important to pause before allowing chronology to become the dominant way these lives are understood. Because behind every name connected to this case, there existed a person whose life contained far more than the circumstances that eventually brought them into public memory. This matters psychologically and ethically. Because when victims become reduced entirely to sequence, pattern, or investigation, it becomes easier to emotionally distance ourselves from the human reality existing underneath those structures. And emotional distance changes the way that people engage with violence. It changes empathy. It changes perception. It changes the emotional relationship between audience and subject matter itself. And by this stage in the case, emotional distance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain within the wider public atmosphere that surrounded these events. Because repeated incidents gradually reshape collective emotional perception. Not all at once, but slowly enough for ordinary life itself to begin feeling emotionally altered by anticipation, uncertainty, and fear. At the same time, pressure on investigators continued growing. And in regards to the human brain and psychology, pressure changes cognition. It changes prioritization. It changes interpretation. It changes the emotional environment within which decisions are made. Because investigations do not occur inside emotionally neutral conditions. They occur inside urgency, inside growing public fear, inside increasing demand for explanation, inside the psychological pressure created when uncertainty continues for too long without resolution. And that pressure creates competing emotional demands. The need to act quickly, the need to avoid mistakes, the need to recognize patterns accurately, the need to avoid drawing conclusions too early. And balancing those competing demands becomes increasingly difficult as fear escalates. Because uncertainty becomes harder to tolerate over time, publicly, emotionally, and institutionally. If we look back, it can be tempting to imagine fear as something dramatic and immediate. A sudden emotional response arriving all at once. But psychologically, fear often develops far more quietly than that. Much more gradually, more subtly, until eventually ordinary life itself begins carrying emotional tension that did not previously exist. And by the time people fully recognise that change, they have already been living inside it for some time. Before we close, it is important to take a moment to step away from the psychology, the investigation, and the wider atmosphere surrounding this case, and return to the people in the centre of it. Yvonne Pearson, Jean Jordan. Both were individuals whose lives extended far beyond the circumstances discussed here. Lives shaped by relationships, experiences, ordinary routines, and futures that existed independently of this case. And recognising that matters. Because without that recognition, it becomes too easy to focus only on fear, pattern, and investigation, whilst losing sight of the people most deeply affected by them. In the next episode, we move further into the growing recognition surrounding the case, examining how fear, pressure, and repeated uncertainty continued shaping both public understanding and investigative response. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow along so that you don't miss what comes next. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.